Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Biosimilars, What You Need to Know. My name is Allison Hoons, and I'm an affiliate knowledge broker and one of the patient advisors at Arthritis Research Canada. I'm pleased to be your moderator for this afternoon as we discuss this important topic of biosimilars. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Before we get started, we'd like to get to know a little bit about you, our audience that's with us today. So we're going to start with a couple of quick polling questions. After that, Dr. Lacaille will then give a half-hour presentation explaining some facts about biosimilars, what they are, and providing some information about them that we hope you will find helpful. This will be followed by a 20-minute period where you can ask questions and we will address your questions. So let's get started with the polling questions. The first question should be popping up on your screen right now. We are interested to know a little bit about who's in the audience today. Please go ahead and answer the option that is the best fit for you. You may actually fit in more than one category, but please choose the option which is best for you. And if you want to, if you choose other, you can even write in the chat box or the Q&A box what that other option is. So we're going to give you just a minute to fill in your responses. So are you someone living with arthritis, a family member of someone living with arthritis, a caregiver, a healthcare professional, or others? So those results should be coming in soon here. And drum roll, here we go. Almost 70% of you are living with arthritis, as do I. About just under 20% fit in the other category. And then family members and healthcare professionals. And we don't have anyone joining us as a caregiver today. So we have one more question to ask you. So we'll take that polling question down. And the second one is specific about biosimilars. And what we're interested in is, what is your experience with biosimilars? Are you currently taking one? Are you thinking about taking one? Have you been asked to start a new medication, which is a biosimilar? Or have you been asked to switch from your original biologic medication to its biosimilar? So if you can just take a moment to fill that in for us. This is the exciting time when we don't know what the results are going to be until they pop up on the screen. And they should be coming up any moment now. And again, it's the one that is the most suitable, the best fit for you. And let's see what those results are. So we have an interesting split, almost equal percentage of people who are thinking about taking a biosimilar or have been already asked to switch from their original biologic to a biosimilar, followed by people who are currently taking a biosimilar and then being asked to start a new one, which is a biosimilar. So that's really helpful information for us in order to know how to present this information today. So thank you for taking the time to answer those. Okay, now today's presentation on biosimilars is being given by a rheumatologist and Arthritis Research Canada Arthritis Research Canada Scientific Director, Dr. Diane Lacaille. Dr. Lacaille holds the Mary Pack Chair in Rheumatology Research and is a professor in the Division of Rheumatology at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Lacaille brings extensive knowledge and expertise to today's topic of biosimilars. Both as a rheumatologist whose patients have been part of BC's Biosimilar Transition program, and as a research scientist who is currently researching biosimilars. If you're thinking of a question as we are providing this information, please feel free to simply click on the Q&A, question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question and then click send. Please don't submit your questions in the chat box. We're going to try and have all the questions in the Q&A box instead. All questions will be answered during the Q&A period as feasible at the end of the presentation. And there's no need to send your questions in advance. We'll take them during the time. So now, without much further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Lacaille.
Hello, I'm just about to just sharing my screen here. 1 minute. There we go. All right, thank you, Allison, for this introduction, and welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. It's my pleasure to be discussing this topic with you. As a rheumatologist, I know how important this question is, and this topic is to the patients that I'm involved in their care. And I know I understand how this transition matters a lot to patients. And I hope that the presentation that I will give you today will be informative and will help you understand what this is all about. And as Allison mentioned, I'll be happy to answer your questions in the question and answer period. So I'm just figuring out how to advance. Hold on. My apologies. There we go. Okay. So first, the overview of today's presentation. I will just say a few words about Arthritis Research Canada, our organization. Then I will spend some time discussing what biologics are and what biosimilars are and how similar they are to the original biologics. I will be discussing the cost of biologics, the benefits of biosimilar transition. I will be just concluding with a few words reviewing the main facts, and then we will move on to our question and answer period. So first, a few words about Arthritis Research Canada, Arthrite-recherche Canada. Our mission is to transform the lives of people living with arthritis through research and engagement. And our vision is a future where research-based services, tools, and knowledge empower people living with arthritis to triumph over pain and disability. Established in 2000, we are the largest clinical arthritis research center in North America. We are headquartered in British Columbia, and we have centers in 3 provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec. Our scientists are affiliated with 5 universities: University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, University of Calgary, McGill University, and Université Laval in Quebec City. We have a team of more than 100 research scientists and staff from multiple disciplines, so doctors, physiotherapists, statisticians, health psychologists related to arthritis. And everyone is dedicated to advancing and sharing knowledge about arthritis. Our center is patient-driven. We have an arthritis patient advisory board, and our members are engaged in all research activities. And this ensures that patient voices are represented throughout the entire organization. So not only in the research projects, but also at the level of the organization in the decision-making process. What we do practical research for everyday living. Arthritis Research Canada does what we call patient-oriented research. Hold on, I need to move my little, there we go. With and for patients to prevent arthritis, help early diagnosis, find new and better treatments, and improve quality of life for people living with arthritis. We are a training hub for the next generation of scientists. We're dedicated to mentoring and supervising trainees at all levels of the postgraduate level in a wide variety of disciplines that mirrors the diversity of our senior scientific leadership. Now on to our topic today, biologics and biosimilar. So what is a biologic medication? Why do we call these biologics? And it's because they are made by living cells. So it's a biological process for making them. So examples of biologics are, they may be antibodies that are produced by the cells. They may be hormones produced by cells, or an insulin is another example of a biologic. And because of the nature of what they are, they have very targeted effects on cell function. And that's what really differentiates them from other medications that we use in arthritis, for example. So for example, they may block a receptor, they may turn on a cell process so that their effects are very specific. As a consequence of the kind of molecule that they're very large and they're a lot more complex than drugs that are made chemically. So for example, if you look here on the right side of my screen, you can see the aspirin, sort of like the, probably the medication, synthesized medication that people know most. You can see the size of it and the complexity of it. Then is insulin. And then after that is a monoclonal antibody, like one of the anti-TNF. So you can see that these molecules are much bigger, much complex than a simple aspirin. So this means that the process for making them is very complicated, and they need to be made using state-of-the-art technology. It's a biological process, therefore there's a certain degree of variability in making the medication. And because they are protein, they cannot be ingested by mouth, otherwise they would be broken down in your stomach. So that is why they have to be taken by either injection or intravenous infusion. And there's many biologics out there on the market that are used for a range of diseases, from diabetes, arthritis, cancer, inflammatory bowel diseases. What is a biosimilar? So a biosimilar is a biologic as well. And it comes to market after patents expire. And a patent is like a copyright. So when a company discovers a new drug, it's protected from other people kind of stealing their intellectual property, if you want, early on. I mean, I shouldn't use the word stealing, but using their intellectual property. And people are not able to make the product for a certain period of time. And it allows the company who have invested a lot of money in making a product to be able to recuperate some of the money that they invested in the research. But once that expires, it then becomes open to anyone to be able to make it or replicate it. So this is the same as a generic medication when a patent expires on a brand name medication. So a biosimilar is a very, very close copy of an originator. A good way to think about it is it's a little bit like a twin, like an identical twin. And because there's two kinds of twin, there can be a fraternal twin and an identical twin. So it's a little bit like an identical twin, where they're very, very similar, but they're not exactly identical. So a biosimilar has the same amino acid sequence, but they're not exactly identical. There can be slight differences in their structure, for example, in the way the proteins are folded. And that's why we call them a biosimilar and not a generic. They're roughly half the price of an originator. And it's not because they are sort of a cheaper version, it's because the company making them does not have to invest in all the research and development to discover and develop the new biologic. And that's why the only cost is the cost of manufacturing it. So the big question is, how similar is a biosimilar? So biosimilars are not identical because of the natural variability in the process to make them. As I mentioned, it's a biological process of a cell. It's not something we can control as tightly as when you do a chemical reaction, and every time you make the same chemical reaction, you have exactly the same chemical product. So therefore, there's a certain degree of variation, even with an originator biologic, between different batches of the originator. So the variation between the biosimilar and the originator is very similar to that. So the second, third, or next batch of an originator is a little bit like a biosimilar to itself. And I want to emphasize that there are very strict controls in place for the manufacturing process, whether it's for an originator biologic or whether it's for a biosimilar. to closely monitor whether differences in the process might have affected the final product. And if the product has any difference, they might have to throw out an entire batch, whether it's an originator or whether it's a biosimilar. And if there have been changes, they need to show that it does not affect how the medicine works or its safety. So what I want to illustrate here in this complicated slide is simply, this is just to show that even for originator biologic, the number of changes that have occurred as they manufacture the medication for each of the originator biologic. And when this happens, they need to submit this to Health Canada or to the other regulatory agencies to show that it doesn't affect the product. So it's just to show that changes in manufacturing are quite common and they are evaluated very closely. So what is the process for a biosimilar to be approved by Health Canada? So in order to be approved, a company must prove that the biosimilar drug is highly similar to the originator medication at the molecular and cellular level. So these are laboratory studies where they show that the structure is highly similar and also the function is highly similar. So what does it do in the cell? How does it move into the cell, through the cell? How does it affect the different mechanisms in the cell? So those are the laboratory studies. And then there are also clinical studies. So they need to show that there is no clinically meaningful differences in either the effectiveness, so what's the effect of the medication on the important outcomes of the disease. So in arthritis, that would be, number of swollen or tender joints, level of pain, etc. In the safety, so that there is no more adverse events or side effects in the biosimilar than in the original, and immunogenicity. And the immunogenicity is how the body responds, how the immune system responds to the drug. And this is all compared to the original biologic, of which the biosimilar is a copy of. Therefore, the approval relies on the results of existing clinical trials from the originator biologic. When they are approved, because they've proven that they are similar, then they are approved for the same indications, which means they're approved for the same purposes, for the same medications for which they are used. And I want to emphasize again that the manufacturing process for a biosimilar is held to the same rigorous quality standards as for the original biologic medication. And that even after it has been approved, the safety of the biosimilar medication continues to be monitored after approval, just like it happens for the original biologics as well. There are processes in place whereby the companies need to report to Health Canada and where the health professionals are mandated to report if there are any serious adverse events or things that were not expected that are observed. So in summary, I think we can say that biosimilars are of the same quality and they deliver the same benefits as the originator biologic medications. What is the evidence on biologics? And there's a number of publications, and particularly switching, because I find that it's often switching that people are more concerned about. And I just wanted to show here in this slide that there have been a number of publications, especially in most recent years, about evaluating policies or the action of switching from an originator biologic to its biosimilar. And I'm going to tell you a little bit. So there was a systematic review of the literature that was published in 2018 that reviewed 90 studies that evaluated either the safety or the efficacy of switching from an originator to a biosimilar. And this represented the cumulative experience of 14,225 patients. So this is just to emphasize we have a lot of experience with biosimilars. There were 7 different medications that were used in 14 different diseases. And the overall finding is that there was no clinically meaningful differences in efficacy, in safety, or in immunogenicity, which, as I mentioned, is how the immune system reacts to the medication. I want to point out one of the studies in that literature review that is because it shows data from real world experience on switching at a larger level. And this is from a biologics registry in Denmark, where they also have a mandatory switching policy. There were 802 patients with either rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, or ankylosing spondylitis, and they were followed for 12 months after switching to a biosimilar. And it had the same efficacy as when we compared to the Originator Biologic that had been used prior to switching, and it had the same stopping rate at 16%. How widely have biosimilars been used? So in Canada, biosimilars have been approved since 2009, and 33 different biosimilars have been approved so far. For arthritis, they've been approved since 2014, so we now have 7 years of experience in Canada. In Europe, they've been adopted earlier and have been used a lot more widely. So they've been approved since 2006 by the European Medicines Agency. They have 72 biosimilars so far that have been approved. And the European Medicines Agency, which is the equivalent of Health Canada, but for all of Europe, published a report 5 years ago. And at that time, they had 10 years of experience, and they had monitored very closely this for safety. And they had not identified any difference in the nature, severity, or frequency of adverse events between the 28, at that time it was 28 biosimilars, and their reference medicine. So I think this is reassuring evidence from a lot of experience in the real world that has happened in Europe. Again, to show how widely these have been used, if we look at the total clinical experience in Europe, this represents 2 billion patient treatment days. If we count the number of days and the number of patients, it's more than 2 billion. And as you can see, there's been an exponential growth where there's sort of it's not a linear, like in recent years, we have more and more experience with these medications. What about around the world? There is an international coalition of medicines regulatory authorities, ICMRA, which is a group of 29 regulatory authorities for medications from countries across the world. So they include Canada, the United States, the European Union, Australia, China, and other, I didn't list all of the countries, as well as a WHO observer. And they also analyzed all of the data to date, and they released a statement of confidence in biosimilars. And there's more statements than the ones that I've included there. But part of their statement is they acknowledge that biosimilars are biologic medicines of proven quality, that they are approved after a rigorous scientific evaluation by regulatory authorities, and that they have been used safely for years. And they reiterate what I mentioned before, that they have no clinically meaningful difference in clinical efficacy, safety, or immunogenicity. Here I wanted to show what are the biosimilars for inflammatory arthritis that have been improved in Canada. So you can see that this is primarily for a class of medication that is called anti-TNF agents. So adalimumab, etanercept, and infliximab. And also rituximab, which is not an anti-TNF, but is also a biologic used in inflammatory arthritis. You can see the name of the originator medication and the biosimilars that exist for each of those originator. And in the last column, the diseases for which they are indicated. Now I want to talk a little bit about the cost of biologics. The important point here is that spending on biologics makes up a very high portion of the spending of the public drug plan budgets. In 2018, biologics made up 23.3% of the total drug spending in Canada. And we're 3 years later, and it's even more now, but this is the latest figure that I had my fingers on. Anti-TNF medications make up the largest proportion of public drug program spending for one single class of medication at 8%. And the spending for biologics, and I'll show you a slide that shows you after this slide, has increased dramatically since the early 2000s. In British Columbia, for example, the public drug plan funding for biologics increased from roughly $81 million in 2014 to $125 million in 2019. Spending for biologics is 3 of the top 5 classes of medications in Canada are for biologic drugs. So we see that there's really an increasing use of these medications, but on top of that, there are a number of other biologics that are currently being studied and that are expected to become available in the next 5 to 10 years. So not only has it grown, but it's going to continue to grow. So this begs the question, how can we afford all these amazing medications that are being discovered that provide incredible benefits to our patients? So this here is to show you the spending on biologics from 2009 to 2018, going from 2.6 billion to 7.7 billion. This is all biologics, not just for arthritis. And you can see at the bottom, the biosimilar spending is really a very small proportion of the biologics. Canada spends more on biologics than most other countries, other than the USA. And we really trail behind in the use of biosimilars at 8% compared to other, and we're way below the OECD median. That was 2017. So this is a potential for cost saving that is not being utilized, and that may allow us to be able to afford the medications that are going to be coming on market. So what are some of the benefits of transitioning from an originator biologic to a biosimilar? So I think, the most obvious one is the opportunity for cost saving. This is a potential for huge saving to public drug plans for a more sustainable healthcare. The Regulatory Agency for Drug Pricing estimated that we could save between $332 million to $1.8 billion over 3 years with biosimilar transition policies in Canada. Now, it's nice to save money, but why is that particularly relevant to patients with arthritis? Well, with many new biologic agents in the pipeline, our drug plan have budgets that are fixed. So if we want them to be able to afford new innovative drugs, they need to spend less on older drugs when there is a less expensive version that is equally effective and safe that is available. So this is the concept of the biosimilar transition policy. In some provinces, using biosimilars has provided easier access to biologics. For example, in New Brunswick with adalimumab, if using a biosimilar version of adalimumab requires people to, quote unquote, fail a smaller number of prior medications before the medication is approved for coverage. And what I mean by fail, it's a terrible term, but it's a term we use. It means that you've tried a medication and it either was not effective or you've had an adverse event to it and you've had to stop it. And then secondly, why it improves access is that provincial drug plans can reinvest the saving to provide access to medications that are currently not covered under their drug plan, either because the medications have been approved but are not currently covered, or for the new medications that are going to be that are currently being studied and are going to be approved. It can also lead to improved healthcare. Governments can reinvest savings into other services that are relevant to arthritis, such as specialized nursing, counseling, physiotherapy, occupational therapy. We know that there are a number of health services that can benefit patients with arthritis that are not currently covered by our government. And this, an example of this has happened in British Columbia in the inflammatory bowel disease, where the savings was reinvested in coverage of nurses to enhance the services provided for patients on biologics. What about the benefits to patients? I've already mentioned that it may reduce the need to have failed older medications before having access to a biologic. But the other thing to think about for people who are on, have their medications covered under an insurance policy is that some policies have lifetime benefits. So switching to a biosimilar medication may prevent a patient from reaching their lifetime benefit and therefore allow them to have coverage for their biologic for a longer period of time. And 60% of biologic prescriptions in Canada are covered by insurance plans. So what are biosimilar policies and why were they put in place? Well, based on the data of usage in Canada, we can see that there's not been a very large uptake of biosimilars. So we need policies to encourage patients and doctors to use biosimilars for an ideal use of limited healthcare resources. There are two types of policy. The first one is that when patients are given a new prescription for a biologic drug, if a biosimilar exists, then they need to start with a biosimilar version of the biologic medication. And the second is a transition policy, which means that if people are using a biologic for which are currently an originator biologic, they need to switch a biosimilar for the same medication when one is available in order to have continued coverage under the provincial drug plan. Biosimilar policies exist in most European countries and now exist in a number of provinces in Canada, which I'll talk about shortly. Health Canada supports biosimilar transition in patients with well-controlled transitions from originator to biosimilar for purposes that are approved. And I want to point out that this is not a substitution done at the pharmacy. This is a prescription change that is made by the doctor. So we have to prescribe the biosimilar medication. And this is something that, because in Europe, some of them are substitution done at the pharmacy, and the medical community emphasize the importance that this be done by a doctor so that there can be a discussion with the patient. So what about experiences in Canada? British Columbia was the first province to have biosimilar policy. In July of 2017, the government introduced a biosimilar policy for the new prescriptions, that we had to use biosimilar if a biosimilar existed for new prescriptions. And in June 2019, they introduced a biosimilar transition policy where we had to switch the prescription from an originator to a biosimilar where it existed. And if we look at what has been that cumulative experience, so far there are 6,620 patients for inflammatory arthritis that have been switched to a biosimilar. There are more if we look at all biosimilars, but I only included there in inflammatory arthritis. And looking at the data that the government has, they see that the time remaining on treatment after the switch is similar to what it is when we compare it to the originator biologics. There was no additional either doctor's visit, emergency room visits, and this is a marker of whether there were maybe adverse events that might have occurred after switching. And there was no increased use of other medications to control the disease, suggesting that the efficacy is similar. And it has led to an estimated saving of $127 million over 3 years. In Alberta, in December of 2019, the Biosimilar Transition policy was implemented, and their estimated savings over the next 4 years has been estimated between $227 to $380 million. And New Brunswick has just announced on the 21st of April that they are starting a switching policy. And I just found out that yesterday, Quebec announced also that they are implementing their biosimilar transition policy as well. So in conclusion, I have explained to you how biosimilars have identical amino acid sequence, so the same, and that they have a very similar structure and function based on extensive lab testing, and that they must also demonstrate that they have similar efficacy and safety in clinical studies compared to the originator medication that they correspond to. Biosimilar are of the same quality and deliver the same benefits to patient as the originator medication that they are a copy of. Biosimilars cost less because of the savings on the research and development cost, but they have the same cost of manufacturing, so they have the same quality of manufacturing. They offer the opportunity for major cost savings, and these savings can be reinvested to improve access to either existing or new innovative medications that will become available in the upcoming years. Real-world experience with switching in Europe and in Canada has been very favorable, with no safety concerns and no evidence of lower effectiveness. I want to point out here some resources on biosimilar. There are a number of excellent resources out there available on the web, at our website on Arthritis Research Canada, which is www.arthritisresearch.ca. We have a document on biosimilars, what you need to know. Health Canada also has a fact sheet on biosimilars. Arthritis Consumer Experts, which is an advocacy and education organization, patient organizations for people with arthritis, has excellent resources about biosimilars, one facts about biosimilars, and another resource on what inflammatory arthritis patients need to know. CADITH has also a document on biosimilar medications, and the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities biosimilar statement that I mentioned earlier. And so I've sort of given you time so that you can look at these. You will also get this presentation for having attended this webinar, so you'll be able to access these resources if you don't have time to rapidly write them down. And I just wanted to show here some studies, references to some of the evidence that was used for preparing today's presentation. And that's all for my presentation. I hope that I've provided you with some useful information, and I am now open for answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lacaille. That was a wonderful journey through some very complex material. You did a masterful job. I have some idea of simply the volume of information which is available, and we really appreciate you bringing it down to some key facts that are important to people like me who are living with inflammatory arthritis and wondering about how biosimilars might impact our lives. So thank you. We're going to go into some questions now, and just a couple of some framing around the questions. It's not really possible to address questions that are specific to your own individual medical situation. You can imagine that often to answer a question well, that is about your own medical situation, the doctor would have to know about the details about your medical situation. So I do see that there's a couple of questions that are about individuals' own medical situations. We have to focus on the questions that would be more general, that would cover sort of as many people as possible, their situations. We also have been asked to include a couple of questions, if time, from other patients who helped to prepare this material, things that were relevant. So we'll try and weave these all together. So to start with, there's
where do you start?
Yeah, let's start with the side effects, because the side effects are the things that as a patient, you really get concerned about how this is going to impact you. Effectiveness is one thing, but the side effects might be the first things that you feel. Sometimes you have to wait for the effects. So what about the side effects? Are the side effects of biosimilars any different from the side effects of the originator biologics?
So the short answer is no, they are not different because they're the same medication. So, you know, the potential side, and let's remember that side effects are things that are potential, things that may happen. They're not things that necessarily do happen. And the profile of the side effects is the same because they are the same medication. So we don't expect, and this is the main thing in those clinical studies, in order to be approved as a biosimilar, they have to show that there's no unexpected surprises, that there's no sort of other things that pop up that we wouldn't expect from the side effects that we already know of the originator medications, and that the frequency of them is the same as what we've previously observed.
Okay. And then in terms of switching from a biosimilar, let's suppose that you started on a biosimilar and that it wasn't perhaps as effective as one might, you were still having some disease activity, and you had to switch from sorry, I've got to read this question again, my apologies. If you're transitioning from an originator, so from the originator biologic to a biosimilar biologic, is that a similar process to switching from one biologic to another biologic?
Okay, I think that's a very important distinction. So I'm glad you've asked that question. So when we switch from one biologic to another, you may be switching from a biologic from what we call them a biologic of a different class, which has a completely different mechanism of action. So that's definitely something completely different. But even within an anti-TNF, you may stay within the same class, but you may switch from one drug to a different medication. So let's say from Humira to etanercept. And you're still within the same class of medication, but it's two different medications. A biosimilar is switching from an originator to a biosimilar is not the same as that because it's the same medication. So it's even less of a switch than that. So if you were on adalimumab, for example, you are remaining on adalimumab. It's the same drug. It's just a different manufacturer. So it's not the same as changing to another medication, neither within the same class nor outside of that class.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really important distinction for us to be aware of, because often we're concerned about switching to a new drug.
Yeah.
It's really a new drug.
No, it's not a new drug. It's the same drug. You're switching to a different manufacturer. That's how you have to think about it.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, one of the attendees found the slide of the different names of the different drugs and the names of the biosimilars and the conditions that it was approved for, very helpful.
Oh, good.
So that might be a good thing to have available on the website for people to access. Thank you. There was a question, what is stopping rate? In one of your slides, you said that the effect, it was the same stopping rate.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, it's always sort of tricky trying to translate sort of some of our more epidemiological kind of language. So often when we want to compare medications, we actually sort of, everybody starts on a medication and then we observe over time, do people stay on this medication or do they drop off, or do they drop out, like in the sense that they stop the medication for various reasons. And they either stop it because it becomes no longer effective or they develop a side effect. So watching whether or not, that's what we mean by a stopping rate. So everybody starts at 100% because you're on it. And then over time, you look at how many people remain on this medication over time. And it's a marker of how well the drug is working. Because if you're staying on the medication, we assume that it's worthwhile, which means that it's either working for you and you're not having side effects. So that's what the stopping rate is. And
thank you. So there's actually one question which has appeared a couple of times, and I think it speaks to needing reassurance as patients that who's paying for the research, and therefore are there any concerns about interpreting that research? And the question which has appeared twice is all research paid for by Big Pharma?
Okay.
Because if so, that might give some concerns about how we should interpret that.
Yeah, that's always a very important, I think that's really important, and it's important for transparency. So, so there's different types of research. We call it the pre-approval research and the post-approval research. So obviously the research before a drug is approved by Health Canada is paid for by the pharmaceutical company because they have to invest in the research in order to get their drug approved. So even for a biosimilar to be approved, even though it's lesser of a cost than if it was an originator, because the medications are, the trials are not as extensive, there is still a certain amount of studies that need to be done. And the pharmaceutical company is the one who pays for that medication. However, I'm going to tell you that the regulatory agencies, whether it's Health Canada or the federal FDA in the US, study these in meticulous detail to make and ask a ton of questions. The company has to submit a ton of detail and really be transparent and show everything. And they are legally bound. They're not allowed to hide anything. And everything is looked at to make sure that every patient is accounted for. There are very, very strict processes in place to make sure that drug companies can't hide anything. So that obviously the studies done before are paid by the pharmaceutical companies because that's how they get their drug approved. The studies that are done afterwards, most of them, some of it may be the company that does post-marketing surveillance, but a lot of it has been paid by non-pharma researchers like myself, for example. I have a grant to look at this in British Columbia, to look at what is happening after this biosimilar transition in order to see is the stopping rate, which we've explained, the side effects and the use of medication different. So there's a lot of researchers that are not affiliated with pharma that are using peer-reviewed grants from funding agencies that are looking at that. There's a lot of government funded funds as well to look at that. So it's not, most of the post-marketing surveillance is, and a lot of these studies are done not by pharma. But
okay.
Some of them
Big pharma at the beginning, before it's approved, after that, then not.
Mostly not. I wouldn't say none, but mostly not.
Okay. Maybe while I'm preparing the next question, there's been several people really finding that slide of the different drugs that are available, the different biosimilars. Is it possible to pull that up and leave it on screen while we address the rest of the questions?
I almost didn't include that slide because it was such a busy slide. I'm glad I included it.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that is something that you could pull up and leave while we address the other questions. Could you do that for us? Maybe
let's keep talking. Oh, I see. I'm the one who has to do that. Oh yeah, because I have the presentation.
Because you have the presentation.
Sorry about this.
That's okay. And maybe
Share my
while you're addressing that, we can talk about some of the questions here are less about biosimilars, such as, is the cause of arthritis known? Is it triggered by infection or bacteria? The cause of arthritis, the single cause is not known. I think we can say that quite conclusively. Here we come with the slide, and we can leave that up while we address these other questions. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so is the cause of arthritis known? I know it's not specifically related to biosimilars as a question, but it has come up a couple of times by attendees.
Yeah, I think there's a very long answer and a very short answer to this. So
Go with
no,
the short
we
one.
don't know the exact cause. There's some genetic predisposition, but it explains a very small proportion of it. There's some environmental factors that are linked to it. It's what we call a multifactorial disease, that a number of things come into play to cause a person to have RA, but overall, we don't know the cause.
Okay, so then moving back to the biosimilars kinds of questions, if somebody was on an originator, moves to a biosimilar because one is available, and there are problems with the biosimilar, can the person move back to the originator?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. And I think that's important for people to know, as a kind of have the security to know that you can go back if needed. So this is something that remember again that every province is slightly different. So I know for sure in BC that, and I've been also assured the same in New Brunswick, which has just recently announced their policy. This will be examined on a case-by-case basis. So yes, if it doesn't work for you, the biosimilar, then your physician will need to submit a request to be able to go back on the originator, and it will be examined on a case-by-case basis. There will need to be some objective evidence. It's not just a matter, I don't like this one as much, I kind of like the other one better, but if there's been, for example, I have had patients who have been switched back because they had either infusion reactions or injection site reactions. But this actually, with the quite now, like 3 years with the new starts and a year with the transition, this has occurred there's been those requests in about 3% of the biosimilars. So it's not something that's happening a lot for a variety of reasons, not necessarily because of an adverse event. So it occurs very rarely, but it is possible, but it's not like an automatic thing. It'll need to be requested and examined and justified. But if it's not working for you, especially if you have an adverse reaction to it, it's mostly the immunogenicity that's a concern, that your immune system may react differently to it.
Thank you. So we have time just probably for another 2 questions, one brief one, and then one sort of more theoretical one. Do we know if other provinces will be introducing transition to biosimilars in the near future? So you mentioned you found out yesterday, Quebec is announcing. Have you heard if there's other provinces that will be doing the same?
I know Ontario has been talking about it and will probably be following, but I don't know exactly when. Though that's the other province that I'm aware. I can't speak for the other provinces, not because I don't think they will, but just because I'm not in the know. I anticipate that most provinces will. And I think some provinces are just waiting to see the experience of the provinces that have done it earlier and to see how it's gone. And I think, BC was the first province to do it. And I think our experience has been reassuring. There will be publications on this showing that it's worked well. And I think it'll be encouraging other provinces to follow suit.
Okay. And then a question, we're all hopeful with what we see with the COVID vaccinations. There's the potential, hopefully, to begin travel at any point. Do you see any concerns with switching to a biosimilar impacting travel insurance?
No, not at all. So you know how with travel insurance, you can't have any changes in your treatment within a certain period before you travel. This is the same medication. It should not be considered like a change in treatment. However, I say that. So as a physician, I would say it's not a concern because it's not a medication change. You're on the same medication. It's just a different manufacturer. But insurance companies being insurance companies, and their job is to, limit what they need to cover. I would encourage you to verify with your insurance policy before you travel to make sure that you wouldn't be disqualified for coverage if you switch from an originator to a biosimilar within that 3-month window before you travel, where you're not allowed to change any medications.
Okay, thank you. Now I see there are many other questions. And I'm pleased it's not Dr. Lacaille who chose which questions to answer. It's me who's been sorting through them. So please don't blame Dr. Lacaille if she wasn't able to answer your questions. But many of them had to do with, is there a biosimilar for your particular drug? And that's why I asked for this slide to come up again. So hopefully many of you are getting the questions answered by looking at that. I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Lacaille in particular for her time today. The wizards behind the scene at Arthritis Research Canada who were responsible for pulling this webinar together. But also and mostly to the participants who are with us today and those who will be viewing this recording, because it's all about you. And I thank you for taking the time to be with us. You will be prompted as soon as this webinar ends to complete a short survey. That survey is really important in helping Arthritis Research Canada in designing webinars for future. So please take the time to provide us with that feedback. We'll also be sending you a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar recording so that you can watch it again if you wish. And in the meantime, you can always find more information at arthritisresearch.ca. So thank you all, be safe, and we look forward to having the opportunity to e-meeting with you again in future.
Thank you everyone for attending. It's been a pleasure.